"Get this kid out of my cockpit. I don't have time to babysit." Captain Holloway Ashford III said it without looking down, his hand already closing around the boy's thin shoulder, already steering him toward the cockpit door like a piece of lost luggage. The boy didn't pull away. He turned his face, not his eyes never moved, toward the sound of the voice, and he said, quietly, "Yes. Sir, I understand." That was all. No tears, no flinch, just a small hand tightening around the cracked leather book pressed to his chest the way you hold something precious when someone bigger than you is deciding whether it's worth anything at all. 23 passengers stood frozen on that jet bridge. 2 flight attendants. A gate agent with her phone still raised mid-photo for the airline's website. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A grown man had just put his hands on a blind 11-year-old boy in front of an entire boarding line, and the silence that followed was its own kind of confession. Nobody in that terminal knew the boy's name yet. Nobody knew what was written and what wasn't inside the book he was holding. Nobody knew that in 28 minutes, at 31,000 feet, that same captain would be alone in a cracked, screaming cockpit, begging that same child by name to please, please tell him what to do. Have you ever been written off by someone who never once asked what you were carrying? Let me take you back. 6 hours earlier, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town, a boy was getting dressed for what he believed would be the best day of his life. The smell of bleach and fabric softener rose up through the floor vents every morning at 5, the laundromat below already running its first loads before the sun was up. Eli Carter knew that smell the way other kids knew the sound of a school bus. It was the smell of mornings, of his mother already awake, of a life built 2 flights of stairs above other people's clean laundry. Renee Carter ironed his collared shirt at the kitchen table like it was a choir robe, slow, careful passes, steam hissing into the cold air. She worked nights cleaning the surgical wing at Mercy General for $14 an hour. $1,200 and some change a month after the union dues and the bus pass, and she had not missed a single one of Eli's school events in 4 years. Not one, not even the ones that meant sleeping 2 hours instead of 6. "Stand still," she told him, and he stood still, the way he always did, listening to the small sounds of her work. The click of the iron, the hum of the radiator. The particular rhythm of a woman who loved him doing something with her hands because she didn't know what else to do with the morning's nerves. On the counter beside the toaster sat a worn leather book, its corners capped in brass gone soft and dark with age. The initials stamped into the cover had been touched so many times the gold leaf had worn away in 2 letters and held on stubbornly in the 3rd M faded, J faded, and a small flying eagle insignia between them, still sharp enough to feel. Eli reached for it the way he reached for it every single morning of his life, fingers finding the brass corners first, then the raised letters, tracing them slow like a prayer he didn't need to say out loud anymore because his hands already knew the words. "You don't have to bring it today," his mother said gently, not for the first time. "He'd want to come," Eli said. "It's the only way he can." She didn't argue. She never did, not about the book. She finished the last pleat of his collar, set the iron down, and pressed her palm flat against his cheek for one long moment, the kind of moment a mother takes when she knows the day ahead is bigger than the boy standing in front of her realizes. The book had belonged to Major Marcus Jefferson, United States Air Force, retired, Eli's father, and it had not left this apartment since the funeral 4 years ago. Until today. Today was Junior Wings Day, an annual outreach event run by Cascade Air for students from the Hammond School for the Blind, 40 miles up the coast. A short regional hop, gate to gate, 41 minutes in the air with a cockpit tour before takeoff and a window seat, useless to most of the kids on board, but offered anyway because somebody in marketing thought it photographed well. Eli had been chosen out of 11 applicants. His counselor, Mrs. Odom, said it was because of his essay. Eli suspected it was because of what he could already recite without being asked. What he could recite was this: the full pre-flight checklist of a Boeing 737, start to finish, in the exact cadence and rhythm of a man who had been dead for 4 years. Marcus Jefferson had flown F-15s out of 3 different bases over a 22-year career, had test-piloted aircraft most civilians never learned the names of, had been decorated twice, and recommended for promotion 6 times. When he retired, he applied to 14 commercial airlines. He was rejected by all 14. The official reason, when one was given at all, was some version of the same sentence, not quite the right fit for the image of the cockpit. He never told Eli that part. Eli found out anyway, the way children find out everything, by listening when the adults thought he was asleep. What Marcus did tell him, every night for 3 years. In a converted garage with a salvaged Cessna instrument panel bolted to a wooden frame, was this: "They can take the wings off my chest, son, but they can't take what's in your ears. Nobody can fly a plane with their eyes closed. But you and I both know a man can land one with his eyes closed, if his ears are good enough, and if somebody taught him right." He recorded it all, cassette after cassette, then digital files when the tapes wore thin, his own voice reading checklists, explaining engine pitch, explaining the difference between a stall warning and a gear horn, explaining what a hailstorm sounds like against a windscreen at altitude versus what hard rain sounds like, explaining everything a sighted pilot learns from a screen and everything a blind boy would have to learn from sound alone. 212 hours of recordings by the time Marcus Jefferson's heart gave out in that garage on a Tuesday evening, mid-sentence, the recorder still running, captured forever mid-checklist. "Remember the numbers, son, the numbers don't lie." Even when people do. Eli had listened to every one of those recordings more times than he could count. He listened to them the way other boys watched cartoons. He listened to them on the bus. He listened to them falling asleep. By the time he was 11 years old, Eli Carter could recite by memory more of a 737's emergency procedures than most second-year first officers, useless knowledge, his mother sometimes worried. Knowledge with no door it would ever open for a blind kid in a country that didn't let blind kids fly. But he loved it anyway. He loved his father's voice in his ears more than he loved almost anything else in the world, and on the morning of Junior Wings Day, he packed that voice, bound in worn leather, brass-cornered initials fading, into his backpack. And he held his mother's hand all the way to the bus stop. What Eli didn't know yet, what nobody at Cascade Air's regional terminal knew yet, was that the captain assigned to host Junior Wings Day that year had a name that connected, in a way none of them could see coming, to the exact sentence that had ended his father's commercial career 30 years earlier. Holloway Ashford III had never had to apply for anything in his life. His grandfather had co-founded Highline Regional, the small commuter carrier Cascade Air absorbed in a merger 11 years ago. His father, Holloway Ashford II, had spent 22 years as Highline's chief pilot recruiter, the man whose signature appeared on every hiring decision, every rejection letter, every quiet note in a personnel file that never made it into an official record but somehow always found its way into a final answer. Holloway III had been flying since he was 16, hired by his own father's old airline the same month he finished training, fast-tracked to captain in 6 years flat in an industry where the average climb took 12. He was, by every account that mattered to him, exceptional. He was also, by the quieter accounts that didn't, a man 3 separate junior officers had formally complained about in the last 5 years. Complaints about language, about temper, about the way he spoke to ground crew and flight attendants, and, on one occasion, an elderly passenger who'd asked too many questions about turbulence. All 3 complaints had been closed without action. All 3 closures had crossed a desk 1 floor above human resources, a desk that still, in some quiet institutional way, belonged to an Ashford. So when corporate communications assigned Captain Ashford to host this year's Junior Wings Day, good optics, a handsome face for the company website, a name the board recognized. Nobody thought to ask whether he wanted children, blind or otherwise, anywhere near his cockpit. He did not. But what nobody in that gate area understood yet, not the photographer, not the gate agent, not even Captain Ashford himself, certain as he was that he understood everything about the boy standing in front of him, was that the 11-year-old in the second-hand blazer holding his dead father's logbook had already spent more hours inside a cockpit, in every way that mattered, than most of the captain's own first officers. The clock on that morning had already started. Nobody could hear it yet, but it was ticking all the same. The boarding area at Gate 14 had been decorated for the occasion. A banner reading "Welcome, Junior Wings." Balloons in cascade airs blue and silver. A small table with juice boxes nobody touched because the kids were too nervous, too excited, too aware that today was different from every other day. 11 students from Hammond filed in with their canes and their service dogs and their chaperones, laughing in the particular unguarded way children laugh when the adults around them have promised something wonderful and for once seem to be telling the truth. Captain Ashford arrived 7 minutes late, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been combed for the cameras, a coffee in one hand that he had not offered to share with anyone. The gate agent, a young woman named Priya, greeted him with the relief of someone who had been fielding nervous parent questions alone for 20 minutes. He didn't return the greeting. He scanned the group of children the way a man might scan a crowded subway car for the cleanest available seat. "Which one's first?" he asked, already checking his watch. Mrs. Odom stepped forward with Eli's hand resting lightly on her elbow, cane folded under his other arm, backpack on his shoulders, the logbook held against his chest the way some children hold a stuffed animal and some children hold something far heavier. "This is Eli," she said. "He's been looking forward to this for weeks." Captain Ashford looked at the boy for exactly as long as it took to form an opinion, which was not very long at all. "He's blind," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Mrs. Odom said, "and he's going in the cockpit." "That's the program, yes," Captain Ashford exhaled through his nose, the particular sound of a man recalculating how much of his morning he was going to enjoy. "Sure," he said, "whatever the brochure says." Have you ever watched someone decide in under 5 seconds exactly how much of you they were willing to see? The cockpit tour began with the other 10 children first, each one given 2 or 3 minutes at the controls while the plane sat parked at the gate, engines silent, photographer crouched in the doorway for the website shots corporate wanted. Captain Ashford was, by all appearances, a different man for those 10 children, patient, almost warm, letting them touch the yoke, explaining the throttle levers in a tour guide voice that had clearly been used 100 times before. When it was Eli's turn, something in his posture changed. "All right," he said, not moving from his seat, not offering a hand. "Let's get this one done." Mrs. Odom guided Eli to the threshold of the cockpit door. The first officer, a younger man named Louis Bray, half rose to help, but Captain Ashford waved him off with 2 fingers, a small dismissive gesture that said this won't take long. "You can't see any of this, you know," Ashford said as Eli found the doorframe with his free hand and stepped carefully over the raised threshold. "The dials, the lights, none of it." "No, sir," Eli said. "I can hear most of it, though." A small laugh, more breath than sound, came from the captain. "Hear it?" "Yes, sir." "The hydraulic pump cycling on your left. The avionics fan behind the panel. That's a 737-800, isn't it? I can tell by the APU whine it's a little higher pitched than the Dash 700. The cockpit went very quiet. First Officer Bray turned in his seat to look at the boy more closely. The photographer, sensing something, raised her camera without quite knowing why. Captain Ashford's jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly the way a man's jaw shifts when something has surprised him and he has decided instantly not to let it. "Lucky guess," he said. "Could be," Eli said, and he didn't argue further. Because his father had taught him that, too, you don't have to win every room. You only have to be right in the ones that count. Eli reached out, slow and careful, his fingers finding the edge of the center console, tracing toward the throttle quadrant the way he'd practiced 10,000 times on a wooden mock-up in a garage that didn't exist anymore. His hand brushed the throttle levers, gentle, curious, the same motion any of the other 10 children had made without comment. Captain Ashford's hand shot out and closed around Eli's wrist. "Don't touch that," he snapped, louder than the moment required. Loud enough that it carried back through the open cockpit door into the cabin where the other children and their chaperones were waiting. "This isn't a toy, and I don't have the patience to explain twice why a blind kid shouldn't be putting his hands on a flight deck he can't even see." Eli went still. Not frightened still. Calm still, the way deep water goes still. "I wasn't going to move it," he said quietly. "I just wanted to know what it felt like." "Yeah, well," Ashford said, releasing his wrist like he'd touched something unclean. "Now you know." The first officer opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. That was the system at work, quiet and invisible. The same system that had closed 3 complaints without a word, a junior officer learning, in real time, that some things you let go because the alternative costs more than your career can absorb. Outside on the tarmac near the boarding stairs, Eli's mother stood with the other parents, unable to hear the exchange but watching her son's posture through the small cockpit window, the particular stillness she had learned over 11 years to recognize as her son holding something in instead of letting it out. 40 minutes later, with the children reseated in the cabin and the cameras repositioned for a final boarding photo, Priya, the gate agent, asked, kindly, if Eli would hold up his father's logbook for the shot. She'd heard about it from Mrs. Odom, thought it would make a lovely image, a blind boy and his father's flight book, the kind of photo that gets shared. Eli lifted it from his backpack, both hands, the way you lift something out of a current so it doesn't get pulled away. He held it against his chest. Captain Ashford, walking past on his way back to the cockpit, paused. "What is that?" he said, not really asking. "My father's," Eli said. He was a pilot. Something crossed Ashford's face, not curiosity. Irritation, the particular irritation of a man whose photo op was running long. He reached out and plucked the book from Eli's hands before anyone could stop him, flipping it open with one thumb, scanning a page upside down to him, clearly expecting nothing. "What is this, some kind of diary?" He laughed, short and sharp. "Can you even—" He stopped himself half a beat too late, the cruelty already out of his mouth before his brain caught up to where it was landing. A few feet away, Priya's camera lowered slowly. Mrs. Odom's hand rose to her mouth. "Useless," Ashford muttered, more to himself than anyone, already turning away, already done, and the book, still open in his hand, slipped from careless fingers as he turned. It hit the tarmac at the edge of the boarding stairs, bounced once, and skidded directly into the path of an oncoming baggage cart. "Watch it," someone called out. Too late. The cart's front wheel caught the spine. There was a sound, small, almost nothing, a crack no louder than a knuckle popping, and then the book lay still on the tarmac. Its spine split clean through, pages fanned loose in the wind, one brass corner bent flat. 23 people on that jet bridge went silent at once. Eli knelt down without being asked, without anyone guiding his hand, found the book by its familiar weight and shape, and gathered the loose pages against his chest with both arms, the way you'd gather something living. "It's all right," he said to no one and everyone, his voice not shaking at all. "He's not in it. Just paper now." Nobody believed him. Not really. Not even him. Captain Ashford, 2 steps away, did not apologize, did not kneel, did not offer a hand. He looked at his watch instead, at the small crowd of frozen, horrified faces, and he said the only thing that came to him, the same 5 words that would, in 28 minutes, become the most replayed sentence in the company's history. "I don't have time to babysit." He turned, walked back up the jet bridge stairs, and disappeared into the cockpit, the door closing behind him with a soft final click. But what Captain Ashford did not know, what none of them knew, standing frozen on that jet bridge with a broken book and a quiet boy between them, was that the book wasn't the only thing his father had left him. The recordings were the real inheritance. 212 hours of a dead man's voice, memorized syllable by syllable in a converted garage that smelled like motor oil and cut grass, and not one word of it had been written on paper at all. You cannot break what was never bound to begin with. And Captain Ashford did not know, could not have known, standing in his cockpit 30 seconds later, doing his own pre-flight checks with the irritation of the morning still sitting in his jaw, that the man whose signature had rejected Marcus Jefferson's application to Highline Regional 30 years earlier, the man who had written not quite the right fit for the image of the cockpit in a file, that should have been destroyed and somehow never was, had been his own father. That detail was still tucked, undamaged, inside the back cover of the broken book, a single folded letter, yellowed at the creases, that Eli had never read with his own eyes because he couldn't, but that his mother had transcribed into Braille for him on his 9th birthday. The year he finally asked why his father never flew for an airline despite being, by every account, one of the best pilots the Air Force had ever produced. He had read that letter, felt that letter, more times than he could count. He knew the recruiter's signature by the particular shape his mother's transcription gave it. He knew the name. He had simply never had a reason to say it out loud. Until today, he hadn't needed to. The boarding finished in a strange, hollow quiet. Mrs. Odom helped Eli into his window seat, useless to him, but kind in its intention, and Renee Carter, watching from the terminal glass because parents weren't permitted past security on this leg, pressed her palm flat against the window like she could reach through it. What she didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that her son was about to do something no 11-year-old in the history of commercial aviation had ever been asked to do, and that he was about to do it not because he wanted to be extraordinary, but because a dead man's voice in his ears had spent 4 years preparing him for exactly this morning without either of them knowing it. The flight pushed back from the gate at 9:14 a.m., 11 minutes behind schedule. It would land, one way or another, in 79. The first 18 minutes of Cascade Air Flight 482 were, by every measure that mattered, unremarkable. Climb to cruise. Seatbelt sign off. The cabin settled into the low hum of small talk and the rustle of juice boxes the Junior Wings children had finally worked up the courage to open. In the cockpit, Captain Ashford flew in the particular silence of a man who has decided the conversation is over, while First Officer Bray ran the radios and said nothing about what he'd seen on the tarmac, because that was the system too, silence. Passed down, generation to generation, until somebody refused to carry it any further. At minute 19, the radar returns changed. It wasn't supposed to be there. The forecast had shown a clean corridor, a narrow band of weather 30 miles south that should have stayed south. But weather, like people, does not always behave the way the paperwork says it will. And the cell that had been sitting quietly off the coast turned, without warning, directly into Flight 482's path. Cascade 482, be advised, you've got a cell building fast at your 12, looks like it's intensifying, came the voice from regional control. Suggest immediate deviation, heading 270. Copy, deviating, Ashford said, banking the aircraft west, too late. The first hailstones hit the windscreen like gravel thrown from a truck bed, a sound that made 3 children in the cabin grab their armrests and 1 flight attendant grab the intercom to begin the calm, practiced script, please remain seated, fasten your seatbelts, this is precautionary. It was not precautionary for very long. A piece of hail the size of a golf ball struck the first officer's side window at an angle the aircraft's engineers had calculated for, and, on this particular morning, the margins did not hold. The window spider webbed, then punched through at one corner, not a full breach, but enough. Enough for a sudden scream of wind, enough for a spray of pressurized air and shattered acrylic. Enough for First Officer Louis Bray to take a piece of debris across the temple and slump sideways in his harness, unconscious before his hand even left the yoke. Louis, Ashford's voice cracked, high and fast, nothing like the voice that had said don't touch that an hour earlier. Louis, talk to me. He didn't. The primary flight display in front of Ashford flickered, fractured by the same shockwave that had taken out the window, 2 of its 3 panels dissolving into static and frost. The windscreen on his own side was crazing rapidly, ice forming faster than the heating elements could clear it, visibility collapsing toward 0 in under a minute. Mayday, 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 Ashford transmitted, and his voice, for the first time in his career, sounded like a man, not a captain. Cascade 482, we've had a window failure. First officer is down. I have partial instrument loss. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable. Copy your mayday. Cascade 482. Control answered, and even through the radio static, Eli, 3 rows back, listening the way he had listened to everything his whole life. Could hear something change in the controller's voice, too. Nearest suitable runway is 41 nautical miles. That's going to put you at about 11 minutes out at current speed. Be advised, that's tight on your fuel state given the deviation. Cascade 482. You have approximately 11 minutes before this becomes unrecoverable. I say again, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Remember that number. In the cabin, the children from Hammond sat very still, the way children who cannot see chaos sometimes process it more clearly than children who can, through sound alone, through the particular tone adults use when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid and failing. Denise Okafor, the senior flight attendant working the aisle, had flown this route for 6 years. She had seen turbulence, seen a medical emergency once, seen a missed connection turn an entire cabin into a shouting match. She had never, in 6 years, heard a captain's voice crack the way Ashford's had over that intercom feed. She moved instinctively toward the cockpit and stopped 3 rows back, where a small hand reached out and found her sleeve. "Ma'am," Eli said very calmly, "is that a right engine surge?" The pitch just changed, higher, then it dropped. Denise stared down at him. "What?" "The engine. It's surging. I can hear it cycling, like it's hunting for the right RPM and not finding it. My dad used to call that the engine arguing with itself. If the captain's losing his display and his first officer's down. Somebody needs to tell him that before he starts compensating for the wrong problem." Denise had no reason in the world to believe an 11-year-old blind boy over 6 years of training. And yet something in the boy's voice, the stillness of it, the total absence of panic in a cabin that was rapidly filling with it, made her crouch down to his eye level out of sheer instinct. The way you crouch for anyone who suddenly sounds like the only adult in the room. "How do you know that?" she asked. "My father was a test pilot," Eli said. "He taught me to listen. Please, I think I can help him. Have you ever had 30 seconds to decide whether to trust the one calm voice in a room full of panic?" Denise made her decision in less time than it takes to read this sentence. She unbuckled Eli's belt, took his hand, and walked him forward up the aisle, past the frozen faces of his classmates, past his own racing heart, to a cockpit door that had, 90 minutes earlier, been slammed shut on him with 5 cruel words. She knocked once, hard, and didn't wait for permission. "Captain, I have someone who can help you." Ashford turned, wild-eyed, frost crawling across his windscreen, blood from a small cut above his own eyebrow where flying debris had caught him too, his hands white-knuckled on a yoke he could barely see past. He looked at Denise. Then he looked at the small boy standing beside her, blazer torn slightly at the shoulder, holding nothing now but the absolute stillness that had carried him his whole life. "This is not the time," Ashford said, voice cracking. "For whatever this is, sir," Eli said, "your right engine is surging. You're compensating left, but the problem's on the right. I can hear it. Let me listen, and I'll tell you what I hear. That's all. You don't have to believe me. You just have to let me try." 9 minutes left. Ashford's eyes, for 1/2 second, went somewhere far away, back to a tarmac, to a book skidding under a baggage cartwheel, to 5 words he'd said without thinking twice. Then the aircraft shuddered hard through another pocket of turbulence, the stall warning chirped once and went silent, and whatever pride had been left in him broke apart completely. "Strap him in," Ashford said. "Strap him in now." Eli was buckled into the jump seat behind the center console, headset placed gently over his ears by Denise's shaking hands, and for 3 full seconds the only sound in that cockpit was the wind screaming through a cracked window and the ragged breath of a man who had run out of every advantage he'd ever been handed. "Talk to me," Eli said. "I don't." Ashford's voice broke. "I don't know what to listen for. Tell me what to do. Please, please, tell me what to do, kid." And there it was. The same word he'd used on the tarmac, kid, boy, the small, dismissive language of a man who had never once had to ask anyone for help in his entire charmed life, except now it came out not as an insult, but as a plea, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance that had carried it that morning. Eli closed his eyes, though it changed nothing about what he could see, and let his father's voice rise up in his memory, 212 hours of recordings collapsing down into the next 90 seconds. "Right throttle. Pull it back 2 notches. Slow. Don't yank it," Eli said, his voice even, almost gentle. "You're chasing a surge that's already cycling down. Let it settle." Ashford's hand moved before his brain caught up, 2 notches back, slow, the pitch in the right engine dropped, steadied, and held. "Good," Eli said. "That's good. Now you're trim. It's going to feel heavy left because you've been compensating for 10 minutes. Ease it back toward center, just a hair. 8 minutes left. Ashford eased the trim. The aircraft's nose, which had been crabbing sideways through the storm, settled, however slightly, into something closer to level. "How do you know this?" Ashford breathed, not really asking anymore, just talking to stay sane. "My father flew F-15s for 22 years, Eli said. He test-piloted aircraft most people never heard of. He applied to 14 airlines when he retired, and every single one turned him down. Highline Regional turned him down first. Their chief recruiter wrote that he wasn't quite the right fit for the image of the cockpit. I have that letter. I've had it memorized since I was 9 years old. The cockpit went very quiet, quieter than the storm allowed for." "What was his name?" Ashford said, very slowly, very carefully, like a man approaching the edge of something he already half knew. "Major Marcus Jefferson," Eli said, "and the recruiter who signed that letter was named Holloway Ashford II. 7 minutes left. Captain Holloway Ashford III did not say anything for 4 full seconds, an eternity. In a cockpit running out of fuel and altitude and time, and in those 4 seconds his face, already pale from cold and adrenaline, drained of whatever color remained, the particular total whiteness of a man realizing, all at once, that the universe keeps better records than people do. But there was no time to sit with it. 6 minutes left, then 5, the runway threshold finally crackling through on the radio, ground control guiding a final approach heading while Eli, voice never once rising above a calm, even register, walked a stranger's son through the last of his father's checklist, sound by sound, number by number, until the wheels of Cascade Air Flight 482 touched a runway 40 1 miles from where they'd taken off, hard but level, and stayed on the ground. The cabin erupted into the kind of sound that only happens when a group of strangers realizes, together, that they are alive. Captain Ashford did not move for nearly 30 seconds after the aircraft rolled to a stop. He sat with both hands still on a yoke he no longer needed to hold, staring at nothing, at everything. While beside him a blind 11-year-old boy quietly removed a borrowed headset and folded his hands in his lap, just like he had every single time his father had finished a recording and told him, gently, "That was a good landing, son. Let's do it again tomorrow." Go back and watch the moment 90 minutes earlier when Captain Ashford grabbed that logbook out of Eli's hands and let it fall. Watch how careless his fingers were. Watch how certain he was that nothing in that boy's grip could possibly matter. That carelessness was already, in its own way, the first crack in the windscreen, long before the hail ever touched it. The fire trucks and ambulances that met Flight 482 on the runway found a first officer with a concussion and a deep gash above his eyebrow, conscious now, demanding to know what had happened in the 11 minutes he'd been out. They found 23 shaken but unhurt passengers. They found 11 children from the Hammond School for the Blind, several of them crying, all of them safe. And they found a captain who, when paramedics asked him to step out of the cockpit first, shook his head and said, "Not yet. Get the boy out first. Get Eli out first." It was the first time in 2.5 hours that he had used Eli's name. The same gate that had watched Cascade Air Flight 482 push back that morning watched it taxi in 79 minutes later. 11 minutes overdue, a fire truck escort trailing it down the tarmac with lights still spinning, the same families who had been frozen on that jet bridge at 9:03 a.m. were there again at 10:33, except now they were sprinting toward the arrival doors, and Renee Carter was first through them, falling to her knees on the terminal floor when she finally got her hands on her son, checking his face, his hands, his shoulders, the way mothers check children even when they've already been told, twice, that everyone is fine. "I'm okay, Mama," Eli said into her shoulder, his voice steady even now. "I helped him land it. I did exactly what Dad taught me. What none of them knew yet, not Renee, not Eli, not even Captain Ashford himself." Sitting motionless in a debrief room 2 hours later while paramedics checked a cut above his eyebrow he didn't seem to feel, was that gate agent Priya's phone. The same phone that had been raised that morning for a marketing photo had never stopped recording. It had captured the cockpit door slamming shut on a blind child. It had captured a baggage cartwheel crushing a dead man's logbook. It had captured 5 words, "I don't have time to babysit," that would within 6 hours become the most repeated sentence in the company's history. For reasons no one in that terminal could have predicted that morning. By the time the sun set on the day Cascade Air Flight 482 nearly didn't make it to its destination, the footage had 11 million views. It started the way these things always start now, quietly, a single clip posted by a Hammond School parent who'd been standing at the gate that morning, 31 seconds long. No commentary needed. A captain's hand closing around a blind boy's shoulder, a book skidding under a baggage cart, 5 words delivered cold, "I don't have time to babysit." By 6 o'clock that evening, a second clip had surfaced, Denise Okafor's own statement given quietly to a local news crew that had shown up at the airport chasing the diverted flight story before anyone knew the real story was sitting in seat 14C. "That boy saved this flight," she said on camera, her voice still raw. 11 years old, blind, and he was the calmest person in that cockpit. "I've flown for 6 years, I've never seen anything like it." By midnight, hashtag I don't have time to babysit was trending nationally, attached not to outrage alone but to something stranger and more powerful, admiration, for a boy whose name most people still didn't know, paired with fury at a system that had nearly let an entire flight crash because the one person trained to listen had been thrown out of the room an hour earlier. By morning, 3 things happened in quick succession that Captain Holloway Ashford III had spent his entire charmed life believing could never happen to him. The first was a phone call from Cascade Air's general counsel, informing him that he was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review, not of the storm, not of the emergency landing, but of the cockpit incident captured on video alongside 3 previously closed harassment complaints from junior staff that had, overnight, been reopened by a board that could no longer afford to look the other way with 11 million views attached to the alternative. The second was a records request, filed within 48 hours by a journalist who had done exactly what nobody at Cascade Air expected a journalist to bother doing. She asked who, exactly, had handled Highline Regional's hiring files in the 1990s, and found, 3 days later, a name that matched a captain currently trending online for all the wrong reasons. Holloway Ashford II, 22 years as chief pilot recruiter. A personnel file, miraculously never destroyed, containing the rejection letter of one Major Marcus Jefferson, United States Air Force, with a single handwritten note in the margin that would be quoted in every major outlet by the end of the week, not quite the right fit for the image of the cockpit. The third thing was the lawsuit. Not from Eli's family. Renee Carter, when reporters asked, said only that she wanted her son left in peace, that he was 11 years old and had already given the world enough for 1 week. The lawsuit came instead from a group nobody had been looking for, 9 retired Black and Latino pilots, men now in their 60s and 70s, who had applied to Highline Regional between 1989 and 2001 and been rejected, every one of them by the same recruiter under remarkably similar language buried in remarkably similar files. A class action that Cascade Air, facing a public relations catastrophe it could not survive a second time, settled within 11 weeks for $4.2 million, not enough. Several of the plaintiffs said publicly to undo 22 years of closed doors, but enough finally to be heard. Captain Ashford was terminated for cause 6 days after the incident, the harassment findings alone sufficient grounds, the company's statement carefully avoiding any mention of his father, his grandfather, or the particular weight of a family name that had protected him for 11 years and could not protect him any longer. He did not appeal. Friends who knew him said he hadn't spoken much, in the weeks after, about the storm or the lawsuit or even his job. What he talked about, when he talked at all, was a sound, the sound of a boy's voice in his headset, calm as still water, telling him which way to turn when he could no longer see anything at all. Cascade Air's board, facing federal scrutiny and a public still watching closely, did not stop at termination. Within a month, the airline announced a full third-party audit of its hiring practices going back to the Highline Regional merger, a mandatory bias and conduct retraining program for every flight crew supervisor in the company, and, in a press release that finally, 11 years too late, named the right person, the creation of a new accessibility framework for its Junior Wings program. Developed in direct consultation with the Hammond School for the Blind and built around audio-adapted instrumentation, the same principle a dead Air Force major had pioneered alone in a garage with nothing but a wooden mock-up and a stack of cassette tapes. The headline that ran in 14 major outlets that week didn't lead with the storm, or the lawsuit, or even the boy's name. It led with the 5 words that had started everything, the ones that had once been meant as dismissal and had become, almost by accident, a kind of reckoning. He said he didn't have time. Then a blind boy saved his flight. 1 year later, on a bright morning at the regional airport where it had all begun, a small hangar that had once stored ground equipment now held something else entirely. A simulator, donated and rebuilt by Cascade Air's own avionics technicians, sat at the center of the room, a real 737 instrument panel salvaged from a retired aircraft, fitted now with raised, tactile markers, audio callouts, and braille placards alongside every switch and dial. A hand-painted sign above the door, made by students from Hammond, read the Marcus Jefferson Wings program. And beneath it, smaller, every pilot deserves to be heard before they're seen. Inside a glass case near the entrance sat a leather logbook, its spine carefully rebound by a technician who had read the news story and driven 3 hours, unpaid, to do it himself. Beside it, mounted on dark velvet, was a single set of Air Force pilots' wings that had belonged to Major Marcus Jefferson. And beside that, a small framed photograph of a father and son in a garage that no longer existed, the boy's hands resting on a wooden throttle quadrant that had once been somebody's idea of a dream too small for the world to take seriously. Eli Carter, 12 years old now, taller, his blazer no longer second-hand, stood at the front of the hangar with a younger student from Hammond beside him. A girl named Talia, 8 years old, blind since birth, her hands trembling slightly over the unfamiliar shape of a throttle lever for the first time. "You don't have to be afraid of it," Eli told her, the way someone had once told him. "Just listen first. The plane will tell you everything you need to know if you let it." Renee Carter watched from the back of the hangar, the same stillness in her son's posture that she'd watched through a terminal window a year earlier, except now it didn't carry the weight of something being held in. Now it just looked like peace. The scholarship fund established in Major Marcus Jefferson's name had, in its first year, sent 4 blind and visually impaired students to specialized aviation camps, fully funded, no family contribution required, $3,000 per student, a number that would have meant nothing to Holloway Ashford III and meant everything to 4 families who had never once imagined the word pilot belonging to their child's future. 9 retired pilots from the settlement had each, independently, donated a portion of their award back into the fund. Men in their 60s writing checks to children they would never meet, closing a loop that had taken 30 years to close. Captain Ashford was not at the ceremony. He had not been invited, and by every account would not have come if he had been. But 3 weeks after his termination, a letter had arrived at Renee Carter's apartment above the laundromat. No return address, 4 sentences long, unsigned except for a single initial. It said, in full, "I am sorry for what I said and for what I broke. I have spent every night since trying to understand how a child showed me more grace in 11 minutes than my own family showed his father in 22 years. Please tell him I heard him. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that." Eli never read the letter himself, not with his own eyes. His mother read it to him once, slowly, and he asked her to read it a second time. And then he asked her to put it away, and he never asked to hear it again. Some things his father had taught him you only need to hear once if you're really listening. If this story moved you the way it moved everyone who watched it unfold a year ago, take a moment to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, sit with this question for a moment. Have you ever decided, in the first 5 seconds of meeting someone, exactly how much of them you were willing to see and gotten it wrong? Here's what really gets me about this one. It isn't the storm, and it isn't even the landing. It's that 11 minutes of pure terror were all it took to prove what one quiet boy had been carrying his entire life, and that it took a crisis instead of curiosity for anyone to finally stop and listen. Calm was never the absence of power in that cockpit. Calm was the power, the whole time. So here's what I really want to know, and I want you to actually sit with it before you answer in the comments. What's the one thing about you that people overlook because of what they can see, the thing you wish, just once, somebody would slow down long enough to ask about instead?